Throughout the first 6 decades of the 20th century, hundreds of thousands of Americans and untold numbers of others were not permitted to continue their families by reproducing. Selected because of their ancestry, national origin, race, or religion, they were forcibly sterilized, wrongly committed to mental institutions, where they died in great numbers, prohibited from marrying, and sometimes even unmarried by state bureaucrats. In America, this battle to wipe out whole ethnic groups was fought not by armies with guns, nor by hate sects at the margins. Rather, this pernicious white-gloved war was prosecuted by esteemed professors, elite universities, wealthy industrialists, and government officials, colluding in a racist, pseudo-scientific movement called eugenics. Edwin Black, War Against the Weak, Eugenics, and America's Campaign to Create a Master Race. In 1911, Governor Woodrow Wilson signed New Jersey's forcible sterilization legislation, which targeted the hopelessly defective and criminal classes. Inspired by the slogan, "Sterilization or Racial Disaster," Wisconsin passed its forcible sterilization law in 1913, with the support of the University of Wisconsin's most influential scholars. Among them, University President Charles Van Hise and progressive sociologist Edward A. Ross. When Charles McCarthy of the Wisconsin Legislative Reference Library queried Ross on the merits of forcible sterilization, Ross pulled no punches. "I am entirely in favor of it," Ross said, "and the objections to it are essentially sentimental and will bear no inspection." Ross assured McCarthy that involuntary sterilization was not nearly so terrible as hanging a man, and the chances of sterilizing the fit are not nearly so great as are the chances of hanging the innocent. In the first 3 decades of the 20th century, eugenic ideas were politically influential, culturally fashionable, and scientifically mainstream. The elite sprinkled their conversations with eugenic concerns to signal their au courant high-mindedness. Thomas C. Leonard, Illiberal Reformers, Race, Eugenics, and American Economics in the Progressive Era. We have not reached the stage where we can proceed to chloroform them once and for all. But at least they can be segregated, shut up in refuges and asylums, and prevented from propagating their own kind. Frank Taussig, professor of economics at Harvard for almost 50 years, author of the widely used textbook Principles of Economics, editor of the Quarterly Journal of Economics for 40 years, president of the American Economic Association in 1904 and 1905, and appointed by Woodrow Wilson to be chair of the United States Tariff Commission in 1917. Howdy everybody, CJ here, your cowboy in the jungle, and Renaissance man in this new dark age. Welcome to episode 269 of the Dangerous History Podcast. In this episode, I'm going to tell the story of the eugenicist who connects Woodrow Wilson to the Nazis in a single degree of separation. Now, longtime DHP listeners, or those who maybe have jumped on board more recently but who have started to go through the back catalog, may recall that way back in DHP episode 210, which was Woodrow Wilson Part 6, and this was, of course, the Wilson episode about his tenure as governor of New Jersey. Way back in that episode, which I made, I'm not even sure how many years ago, I mentioned in that episode the subject of this episode that you're listening to now, which is one Dr. Edwin Katzen-Ellenbogen. Based on listener feedback after that episode, there was a lot of interest in this little-known individual, and I mentally made a note to maybe return to Katzen-Ellenbogen as the focus of a DHP episode in his own right. But at the time, I just didn't have much more info about his life and career other than the basics that I mentioned in DHP episode 210. But in the years since I made that episode, I've come across quite a bit more, even though I admit there's still a lot about Katzen-Ellenbogen that is unknown, or about which information is vague, or contradictory, or perhaps both. I'll tip my hat to the key source that gave me a lot more detailed info about Katzen-Ellenbogen, and that is the book War Against the Weak by Edwin Black. Just sort of a funny coincidence that he has the same first name as Dr. Katzen-Ellenbogen. This book is a great, dense, highly detailed, and well-researched book about the history of eugenics. I honestly can't remember if I owned a copy of this book yet or not back when I made DHP episode 210, but if I did, I hadn't read it yet. But in more recent times, I started to look through War Against the Weak and read parts of it and realized that the book had a lot more info on Katzen-Ellenbogen than what I had known about and included in Woodrow Wilson Part 6. And another book that I've come across in the time since I made DHP episode 210 that has some very solid and relevant info in it, not on Katzen-Ellenbogen specifically, but on American eugenics in general, and especially on the links and the overlap between eugenics and progressivism, particularly the academic realm of progressivism in the early 20th century, and it looks at it all from a critical point of view, which is rare in modern academia, is Thomas Leonard's book, Illiberal Reformers, which is very good at chronicling how eugenics was not primarily an ideology of something like Ku Klux Klan rednecks, but was in fact the ideology of Ivy League educated blue blood aristocrats, corporate bigwigs, academia, as well as leading progressive politicians of the day. Illiberal Reformers masterfully shows the degree to which progressivism and eugenics are inherently and organically and logically connected as doctrines, because both believe that an unlimited state run by so-called scientific experts should be given a free hand to do whatever those experts deem necessary in order to control society and to make it progress along their preferred path, their definition of what constitutes progress. So between those two books, and by the way, Illiberal Reformers I don't think ever mentions Katzen-Ellenbogen by name, so it didn't give me details on his biography, but it just gave me a lot more detail on the overall context. But between those two books and some other articles and things that I've come across since I made Wilson Part 6, and like I said before, the interest that people seem to show every time that I mentioned Katzen-Ellenbogen, this guy who wrote Woodrow Wilson's eugenics law, and then 3 decades later shows up collaborating with the Nazis, plot spoiler. I decided now that I had this additional information about him and his context that I ought to go ahead and make this episode you're listening to now. So, I hope you enjoy. So, as the opening quotes of this episode indicated, the first several decades of the 20th century were the heyday for what we might think of as classical eugenics in the U.S. And not coincidentally, they were also the heyday of what I would call progressivism version 1.0, which is the iteration of American progressivism that is of the kind of Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson era. And while the first several decades of the 20th century were the heyday of classical eugenics, the impact of these ideas continued long after the ideas themselves were largely discredited and abandoned by most thinking people. And this often happens with bad ideas, where they continue to impact policy in the real world, like some sort of horrific hangover long after they've been largely discredited intellectually. For another example of this, just see the economics that has been dominant over the last 100 years or so. And the degree to which, for example, rehashed Keynesianism just keeps dominating real-world economic policy of most Western governments, no matter how many times it fails in practice or is destroyed in theory. But I digress. So before I start to dive into the bizarre biography of Dr. Katzen-Ellenbogen, a word about eugenics to give it some context. As I've already indicated, eugenics was a major intellectual force throughout the Western world in the early 20th century. And my simplified working definition of eugenics here is that it's the belief that people can be sorted into a hierarchy of desirability and undesirability, or fitness and unfitness, whatever you want to call it, based on their heritable traits, and that scientific experts can identify these traits with certainty. And as a corollary or outgrowth of that the state, under the guidance of those scientific experts, should be given unlimited power to intervene into people's reproductive lives in order to control who is and who is not allowed to reproduce. And in its more extreme forms, eugenicists also often want to be able to control even ultimately who's allowed to live and who is not. And in the first 3 decades of the 20th century, out of all the major Western countries, the United States produced the most eugenics, by which I mean both the most academic work on eugenics as well as the most practical policies that tried to implement these ideas. And in the United States, the centerpiece of the eugenics movement was what we would think of today in our terms as a think tank. I don't believe that word would be around until the mid to late 20th century, but it was called the Eugenics Research Association, or ERA. Now, eugenics was already growing as an intellectual movement when this organization was founded, but once it was founded, it really kind of helped to drive the movement forward to new heights. The Eugenics Research Association was founded in June 1913 by 51 leading eugenicists. And over the course of its existence, it never exceeded 500 card-carrying members. But these members tended to be very elite scientists and academics. So in terms of influence, they always punched well above the weight of their raw numbers. And membership was dominated by professors from Ivy League medical schools as well as Johns Hopkins University Medical School. By the way, you may recall that Johns Hopkins University is where a young Woodrow Wilson had, at the hands of various progressive professors, earned his PhD in political science. No coincidence there. That the university that was one of the leaders in pushing progressive, quote-unquote, social science was also one of the leading universities pushing eugenics in its medical departments. The Eugenics Research Association not only had members from America's most elite academic institutions, but it also, even more importantly perhaps, had the financial backing to the hilt of some of the biggest corporate kingpins and fortunes of the time. Most importantly, the Rockefeller Empire. In 1912, just a year before the ERA was created, thanks to the help of the New York State government, the Rockefeller Foundation was created as a tax-exempt foundation for allegedly philanthropic, humanitarian, and academic purposes. And while the foundation did do some things that could arguably be seen as purely positive and genuinely philanthropic, a lot of its activities are actually quite sinister when you view them from a point of view that is even a tiny bit skeptical of power. As I've mentioned in some previous Dangerous History podcast episodes in years gone by, the Rockefeller Foundation was central in, among other things, changing American schooling and making American schooling less about individual learning and enlightenment and improvement, and more about creating docile, obedient cannon fodder and worker bees, making people just educated and literate enough to competently do dead-end blue and white-collar jobs and pay their taxes and do what they're told and obey orders and support and even fight in wars against whomever they're supposed to see as the mortal enemy of this week, according to their rulers. But not to make them truly educated enough to do things like think critically about the system of velvet-gloved authoritarianism that robber barons and state officials were, at that very time, stealthily and incrementally building around them in order to keep them in their places and to more efficiently exploit them. In fact, all three of the so-called Big Three original corporate foundations, the other two being the Ford and Carnegie foundations, that were created in early 20th century America to, number one, allow robber baron families to protect their wealth from the taxes that were at the time being levied on middle and upper middle class Americans, in order that the robber barons could kind of pull up the ladder of upward mobility behind them. But in addition to just preserving wealth under the auspices of charitable foundations, these foundations were also used to back all sorts of shady projects, or what you might think of as shady projects if you're actually a fan of things like human liberty, class mobility, intellectual freedom, and so forth. These were projects very often done with collusion with various levels of government that would, so the oligarchs hoped, keep the middle and lower classes of America in their place so that the oligarchs could then be the new permanent American aristocracy. And in our time, other major foundations have been created in the ensuing years by later corporate kingpins, and perhaps the most important and most sinister of the kind of more recently created tax-exempt foundations is the Gates Foundation. Interestingly, these giant foundations are almost always heavily involved in various types of medical research, among other things, including education reform, quote-unquote. In the early 20th century, John D. Rockefeller Jr., the son of the founder of Standard Oil, he in particular was a huge fan and supporter of eugenics, and there's all kinds of correspondence between him and leading eugenic intellectuals of the time, and you can also follow the money, as they say, to see just how much he loved eugenics. And as a result of John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s support, the ERA would get hundreds of thousands of Rockefeller dollars, as well as similar-sized donations from some other oligarchical families, such as the Harrimans, in order to boost the ERA's power and reach. And keep in mind, this is hundreds of thousands of 19-teens dollars, when the dollar was still backed by gold, at a ratio of $20 to an ounce of gold. So this equates to tens of millions, if not more, in our heavily eroded and devalued 2024 dollars. By the way, some of you longtime listeners may remember me mentioning both the Rockefeller and Harriman families in some of my episodes on power elite factionalism in the U.S. at the turn of the last century. And the Rockefeller and Harriman business empires, along with the investment banking firm Kuhn Loeb and Company, around the turn of the last century formed an anti-House of Morgan coalition. And as you may remember me mentioning in some of those episodes, both sides of this split, the House of Morgan on one side and the Rockefeller-Harriman-Kuhn-Loeb alliance on the other, had politicians who were quote-unquote their operatives in both major political parties at the time. In other words, you can't just say, oh, the Morgans were all Democrats and the Harriman-Rockefeller-Kuhn-Loeb alliance were all Republicans, or vice versa. You can't. Both sides of the split had their guys in both parties, or had guys who were their guys in both parties is a better way of saying it. And for this reason, I've often argued that if you're looking at high levels of American power elite politics from roughly the 1890s through World War II, Looking at the Morgan versus anti-Morgan rivalry is often more useful to really understand what's going on and why it's happening than is looking at just partisan politics, Republican versus Democrat, which was then, like it often still is today, at best, like looking at the shadows on the cave wall in Plato's famous analogy and thinking that you're seeing what's actually happening. And just looking within the component factions of the anti-Morgan alliance at the time, the Rockefellers were Republicans, and the Harrimans and the Kuhn-Loeb people were major players in the Democratic Party. And in fact, the Harrimans would still be major overt players in the Democratic Party at least through the 1960s, and for all I know they still are today. I honestly haven't looked into it, and if they are, though, they're doing it on a more covert sort of way than they were, from the late 19th century through the 1960s. And the Morgans, so this means the anti-Morgan alliance had pull in both parties, and the House of Morgan did the same thing. They had Republicans who were their guys, and they had Democrats who were their guys. And through this method, each faction ensured that no matter which party was dominant at any given time, at least some of the leaders of that party would be their guys. Just one more interesting side note on this, the Bush family has long-standing, very close ties to both the Rockefellers and the Harrimans, going back well over a century at this point. And this is despite the fact that the Bushes have pretty much always been Republicans and the Harrimans have always been Democrats. And if you thought party politics was the be-all, end-all of everything, you'd think, well, they would never work together and be friends and business partners and whatever, but you would, of course, be wrong. In fact, Prescott Bush, the father of the first President Bush and the grandfather of George W. Bush, one of the things he did prior to becoming a senator was, for a while, he worked at the Harriman family financial firm, Brown Brothers Harriman and Company. As I've said many times, political parties don't matter as much as you think they do when you get up in the rarefied air of the genuine oligarchs and their gophers, their lackeys. And wealthy and influential as the Bush family, for example, may be, they are not genuine oligarchs. In other words, they are not owners of this country themselves. They're managers. They work for people like the Rockefellers and Harrimans, who are the real owners of this country. Not just the Rockefellers and Harrimans, there's many other families and factions, but just using them as examples. It's always important to keep in mind that the people who actually run for and get elected to or get appointed to high political office, most of the time, they are not the actual oligarchs. They are the gophers. They are the lackeys. If you want to be charitable, you call them the managers. But people like the Rockefellers would not look at people like the Bushes as their equals, much as they might be, on friendly terms and work together and whatever. But there's clearly a relationship of subordination. But back to today's story. It would be the American foundations, especially the Rockefeller Foundation, but also the Carnegie and Ford Foundations, that would bring the quote-unquote science of eugenics to Germany in the early 20th century. And the eugenics of American progressives would become the foundation of Nazi eugenics in the 1930s and 40s. Dr. Edwin Katzen-Ellenbogen, the subject of this dose of dangerous history, was a bona fide founding member of the Eugenics Research Association. In fact, Katzen-Ellenbogen was charter member number 14 of the ERA. And in 1911, just a couple of years before the ERA was founded, Woodrow Wilson became the governor of New Jersey and, among many other things, signed into law a eugenics bill during his first year in that office. And that bill was written by Dr. Katzen-Ellenbogen at Wilson's request. By the way, Katzen-Ellenbogen was also a founding member of the Carnegie Institution for Science, which was one of the many quote-unquote philanthropic research organizations set up by the Carnegie Foundation in the early 20th century, and not surprisingly, Katzen-Ellenbogen worked on eugenics for them as well. So, who was Edwin Katzen-Ellenbogen? Well, he had a background in psychology and psychiatry with a particular emphasis on epilepsy and eugenics. His background, and many later aspects of his life even, remain pretty murky. Sources often differ on lots of little details, and often there's just stuff missing entirely. Katzen-Ellenbogen apparently even spelled his name in various ways over the course of his life, sometimes 2 words with a hyphen, sometimes 2 words without a hyphen, and sometimes just 1 word, with no space or hyphen, between the Katzen and the Ellenbogen. We're not even sure exactly when he was born, not just the day, but even the year. He was supposedly born in either 1881 or 82, in a part of what today is Poland that was at that time still part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Edwin Katzen-Ellenbogen was of at least partial Jewish ancestry, though I have not been able to ascertain if there's any records that indicate just how much of his heritage was Jewish, like a percent or something. But his Jewish ancestry apparently did include a line of distinguished rabbis in East Central Europe who had the last name Katzen-Ellenbogen. But Edwin seems to have not been at all proud of that ancestry. In fact, growing up, he was educated at a Jesuit high school, and in adult life seems to have been a practicing and possibly even true-believing Catholic, and he definitely seems to have preferred to identify himself as a Catholic rather than a Jew. One definitely gets the impression that if he could have waved a magic wand to eliminate all indicators of his Jewish ancestry, he probably would have happily done so. Katzen-Ellenbogen was educated at universities in Poland and Germany, where he studied medicine. He graduated with a medical degree from the University of Leipzig in 1905 and moved to the United States the same year. Initially, he settled in Massachusetts, where he married an 18-year-old woman named Marie Aurelia Pierce, who was the daughter of a Massachusetts State Supreme Court justice and whose family had been prominent in the state since it was a colony. Not long after getting married, Katzen-Ellenbogen moved back to Europe to pursue some further education in psychiatry, and he was funded by money from his new wife's family. During this time, among other things, he learned hypnosis. Katzen-Ellenbogen returned to the United States in 1907 and became a citizen. He worked at the Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts and even taught abnormal psychology at Harvard. He developed expertise, or at least he claimed to have expertise, on people faking psychological symptoms in order to try to get themselves off the hook for crimes, and he even had an article on this subject published in the Journal of Abnormal Psychology. From there, he branched out into studying epilepsy, and sometimes sort of combined the two interests. So, for example, he once gave expert testimony in the cases of a man who was on trial for murder, but who was trying to use the defense of mental incapacity due to alleged epilepsy. And thanks in part to Dr. Katzen-Ellenbogen's testimony, this man was ultimately convicted, his defense of mental incapacitation was not believed by the jury, and the man was sent to the electric chair in 1912. In 1911, during Woodrow Wilson's first year as governor of New Jersey, Wilson appointed Katzen-Ellenbogen to be director of the Psychopathological Laboratory at the New Jersey State Village for Epileptics. Notice all the things I've already mentioned about this guy's career up to this point, that he's got a strong pedigree of quote-unquote respectable elite academia. Educated at some of the most prestigious universities in Europe, taught at Harvard, etc., etc. So, as far as a fellow progressive academic like Woodrow Wilson was concerned, Katzen-Ellenbogen's CV checked all the right boxes. Katzen-Ellenbogen had even been listed as a top psychologist in a prestigious Who's Who type book titled American Men of Science. And these sorts of things are the kinds of institutional, establishment academia credentials that guys like Woodrow Wilson and his equivalents in our time always tend to hyperfixate on. And so it's easy to understand why someone with Woodrow Wilson's background and ideology would think Katzen-Ellenbogen was great and would appoint him to an important position in New Jersey. And Edwin Black, in War Against the Weak, even goes so far as to call Katzen-Ellenbogen, quote, the chief eugenicist of New Jersey under then-Governor Woodrow Wilson, end quote. Because by the time Woodrow Wilson appointed him to that important position at the New Jersey State Village for Epileptics, Katzen-Ellenbogen was already getting very heavily into eugenics. And again, just, 1 year after Wilson appointing him to that important job, he would be Charter Member 14 of the Eugenics Research Association. And it was also in 1911, again, during Wilson's first year as governor of New Jersey, that at the governor's request, Katzen-Ellenbogen drafted the New Jersey Eugenics Bill that Governor Wilson would then happily sign into law. This bill set up a state board of supposed experts that were empowered and authorized to be able to order the sterilization of so-called defectives, with nothing that even remotely resembles proper due process. Now, this specific bill was actually thrown out pretty quickly by the New Jersey State Supreme Court. If memory serves, the justification was that it violated the State Bill of Rights, which, good for the New Jersey State Supreme Court for doing that. But similar bills were passed in many other American states around this time period, and many of them stayed on the books, were not thrown out by their respective state Supreme Courts. In some cases, they stayed on the books for many decades, and they absolutely were enforced. So, for example, it was a similar eugenics sterilization law in Virginia, called the Virginia Sterilization Act of 1924, that would result in the famous 1927 Supreme Court case of Buck v. Bell, in which, by an 8-1 majority, the Supreme Court of the United States upheld the Virginia sterilization law. And in the majority opinion for the decision, that super duper uber establishment respected Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. famously wrote, quote, "We have seen more than once that the public welfare may call upon the best citizens for their lives," end quote, by which he means the draft in time of war. Keep in mind, this decision is being written only a decade after the U.S. fought World War I with an army that consisted almost entirely of conscripts. Back to Holmes, quote, "It would be strange if it," meaning the state, "could not call upon those who already sap the strength of the state for these lesser sacrifices," meaning being sterilized, "often not felt to be such by those concerned, in order to prevent our being swamped with incompetence. It is better for all the world if, instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime, or to let them starve for their own imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting the fallopian tubes. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough," end quote. This case is so horrifying from anything but a statist authoritarian point of view that it probably deserves its own DHP episode at some point. So I won't delve into the details and the specifics of, what was behind the case and its aftermath and all that here. But just notice, even from the passage that I quoted a moment ago, that Holmes is justifying the sterilization law by pointing to 2 precedents that already existed at the time, one being the military draft and the other being forced vaccinations. And this is a very clever move that is often used, was used then and is still used today to justify new forms of tyranny and invasions of rights, to point to other previous and largely, kind of accepted precedent examples of tyranny and invasion of rights. And really, in some ways, one could argue that conceding the right of the state to draft citizens unwillingly into the military is sort of like the one tyranny to rule them all. Because almost every new state invasion of liberty has at some point or another been justified by somebody, often on the Supreme Courts, with an argument that goes something like this. Well, we already allow people to be forcibly conscripted into the military and to go fight and die in war, whether they want to or not, so by comparison, doing X, and you can fill in X with almost anything from the income tax to forcible sterilization, to forced vaccination, to censorship, etc., etc. X is much less drastic and oppressive than conscription. So if you allow collectivist statist tyranny to win in one area, sooner or later, that victory on their part will almost certainly be cited by future statist collectivist authoritarians as a precedent in order to legitimize the next chunk of personal liberty that they're looking to hack off. Give them an inch, and eventually they'll take, not a mile, eventually they'll take everything. And the slippery slope, as I've often said, is not a fallacy. If the institution or group or whatever that you're talking about, that you're applying it to, has a long, consistent track record of always incrementally taking more when you concede anything. And just by way of closing out for now, this particular side quest of Buck v. Bell. Yes, Carrie Buck, the subject of the case, was ultimately sterilized after the court ruled against her. And very, very interestingly, in the aftermath of World War II, at the Nuremberg trials, SS Obergruppenführer Otto Hoffmann would cite Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes's Buck v. Bell opinion in his own defense for the crimes that he was on trial for. Birds of a feather. That Virginia Sterilization Act remained on the books for decades and was still being enforced up through 1979. And during its 55 years in operation, over 7,000 people were sterilized under the provisions of the Act, and that's just in Virginia, a single mid-sized U.S. state. Not even taking into account the other states, which had laws like this on the books during that time. But back to our lovely eugenicist psychiatrist. In 1915, Dr. Edwin Katzen-Ellenbogen returned to Europe. He initially went to Russia. Remember, this is during World War I, by the way. And then from there, he eventually moved to Germany. And at some point around this time, I don't know if it was before he moved back to Europe or while he was back in Europe, he became estranged from his wife, and I'm not sure if they ever got a formal divorce or not, but they pretty much, separated anyway. Katzen-Ellenbogen remained on the roster of the American Eugenics Research Association, however, until March of 1918, when he was dropped by the group from the organization just due to his German associations, in that atmosphere of hysterical Teutonophobia that propagandists had whipped up in the U.S. during the First World War. 5 years after Katzen-Ellenbogen had moved back to Europe, his life took a pretty tragic turn, when in 1920, his only son, who was still living in America, fell off a roof and died. And it seems that Katzen-Ellenbogen was plunged into deep depression by this, and he would exhibit suicidal tendencies in the aftermath of it. He also plunged deeper into religion and even mysticism as part of dealing with his grief as well. Edwin Black writes of Katzen-Ellenbogen after his son's death, quote, "He emerged with the disconnected sense of a man with nothing to lose. Abortionist, drug peddler, informer, medical theorist, murderer. Katzen-Ellenbogen eventually drifted into all of these realms. This American eugenicist would disappear from America, but his biological vision of humanity would eventually shock the world." End quote. In the interwar years, Katzen-Ellenbogen began kind of moving around periodically various European capitals, and he was living in Germany when the Nazis took over there. According to the 1935 Nuremberg laws, Katzen-Ellenbogen, despite his Catholicism and his lifelong attempts to cover up and minimize his Jewish ancestry, found himself legally defined as Jewish and therefore facing all of the mounting anti-Jewish laws and so forth. So in 1936, he quite sensibly fled the country. But unfortunately for him, the country he fled to was Czechoslovakia, which the Nazis took over just a few years later. And in early 1939, when the Nazis took over Prague, where Katzen-Ellenbogen was living at the time, he fled. But again, he didn't make the greatest choice in where he fled to, because he fled to France and settled in Paris, where not long after he was still living when the Nazis took that city over. He was arrested by the Gestapo in 1941, but was quickly released. It seems he was then arrested and released by them a few more times over the next few years. And this sort of thing happens somewhat frequently in occupied France with characters like Katzen-Ellenbogen, who had, from the Nazis' perspective, somewhat suspicious backgrounds, but who were not, members of the French resistance or anything quite so blatantly threatening to Nazi rule. But they definitely kept their eye of Sauron on him, as they did on so many others. Katzen-Ellenbogen would be arrested by the Gestapo for what would be his final time in the summer of 1943. The Gestapo still had mixed feelings about him. They wanted to round him up because of his Jewish ancestry and some other things in his background, but they also seemed to have known about and very much respected his work in eugenics, and they also just in general had a shortage of doctors. Edwin Black writes, quote, "As a distinguished physician and psychiatrist who spoke German and also enjoyed American citizenship, Katzen-Ellenbogen became very useful to both the Gestapo and the Wehrmacht. Twice, he was brought to the Reich military prison in France to examine a German soldier suffering from mental problems. Katzen-Ellenbogen even testified as an expert at the soldier's trial." End quote. He also spoke French fluently too, and a number of other European languages to at least, decent competence, and this also upped his value to the Nazis. Katzen-Ellenbogen continued to practice medicine for the Nazis in Paris for a little while, even though he was technically still under arrest and a prisoner of theirs the whole time. But ultimately, he was sent to Buchenwald, that slave labor camp in Germany, in September of 1943. Not only was Buchenwald a slave labor camp that worked prisoners to death by the thousands, it also was the site of some horrifying medical experiments conducted on the prisoners. Among the experiments conducted there was one in which they injected prisoners with typhus and then just watched the disease to see what happened. And this was done ostensibly to help develop a vaccine somehow. To me, this is like an even more lethal version of the notorious Tuskegee syphilis experiments conducted on African Americans in the U.S. at the time. As in so many things, the bad things being done by American progressives were done just to a greater degree, to a more extreme form by the Nazis. Other prisoners at Buchenwald were burned with phosphorus just to see what would happen, while others still were castrated in order to study the effects of castration. Homosexual prisoners were experimented on with synthetic hormones and gland implants in order to, you might say, science the gay away. Those who survived these experiments were often finished off by lethal injection. Discipline of the workforce at Buchenwald was beyond draconian. Among many other things, prisoners were hung up by their wrists, they were bludgeoned to death, they were simply shot, and so on. Many of the Buchenwald inmates were assigned to work at the nearby V2 rocket factory, which was built under a mountain, where discipline was, if anything, even more horrifying and draconian than it was at Buchenwald. This V2 factory, by the way, was overseen by none other than rocket scientist Wernher von Braun, the man who, after World War II, would be saved by the CIA's predecessor, the OSS, as part of Operation Paperclip. Von Braun would not only be saved from the justice he should have gotten for his crimes against humanity, but he also was moved to the U.S. and given various good-paying and prestigious jobs in the U.S. military-industrial complex and space program, and he even got to go to Disney World before dying of natural causes in the late 1970s. By the way, the death rate of inmates unlucky enough to go to work at von Braun's V2 factory was reportedly around 90%. Edwin Black writes of Buchenwald, quote, "Large electric lifts continuously shuttled corpses to waiting crematoria, which operated 10 hours a day and produced prodigious heaps of white ash. Death was an hourly event at Buchenwald. Ultimately, more than 50,000 perished." Quote. And even death wasn't the end of the horror, Black tells us, quote, "Pathologists in Block 2 dissected some 35,000 corpses so their body parts could be studied and then stored in various jars on shelves. Tattooed prisoners were especially prized. In Block 2, their skins were stripped off, tanned, and stretched into lampshades and other memorabilia." End quote. Dr. Katzen-Ellenbogen, for his part, not only dodged all of these worst elements of being a prisoner at Buchenwald, but he actively collaborated with his captors in facilitating their abuse of other not-so-lucky inmates. Rather than its brutality, he was most impressed by the camp's efficiency, later saying, quote, "I was really amazed about the efficiency and quickness about everything that happened there." End quote. Of course, as some of you may recall from my previous treatments of the ideology that I call American Progressivism version 1.0, efficiency was one of their favorite catchphrases. They often spoke of their wish list of economic and political reforms that they wanted to foist upon the American people as being, more than anything else, designed to bring about efficiency. The writings of Woodrow Wilson and, even more so, some other leading progressive intellectuals, such as Herbert Crowley or Richard T. Ely, for example, are just loaded with the term efficiency. This clearly reflects the technocratic and scientistic, as contrasted with scientific, mindset that so many progressive intellectuals had. The belief that they, the anointed, value-free, ideology-free, quote-unquote experts, could manipulate and control human beings just as easily and simply as a physicist manipulates and controls inanimate matter. And this is a mindset that applies an engineer methodology to human beings, and hence they give us terms like social science, human engineering, human resources, and so forth. And taken to its logical conclusion, it is an extremely sociopathic way of ruling human beings. And it tends to produce some nasty effects because ideas have consequences, as the saying goes. Thomas Leonard sums it up as follows in his book Illiberal Reformers, quote, "Progressive-era eugenics was anti-individualistic. It promised efficiency. It required expertise, and it was scientific. Its raison d'etre was the belief that racial health was too important to be left unregulated. The individual's liberty to make her reproductive, marital, labor, and locational choices, free from state interference, ended precisely at the point where her choices were seen to endanger the health of the race. Eugenics was premised also on efficiency, another progressive lodestar. Eugenicists substituted social selection for natural selection, based on the belief that natural selection, let alone, was too slow, too inefficient, too inhuman, and too indifferent to progress. As Francis Galton encapsulated it, what nature does blindly, slowly, and ruthlessly, man may do providentially, quickly, and kindly." End quote. No doubt, American progressive eugenicists, Edwin Katzen-Ellenbogen and the Nazis themselves would have all seen themselves as simply acting out that quote from Galton. None of these groups or individuals thought they were the baddies. They thought they were on the right side of history. They thought they were following the science. Katzen-Ellenbogen also said later of Buchenwald, quote, "We were treated not badly there," end quote. To which my response is, what do you mean, we? Because I think if he were being honest and accurate, he would have said, I. The Nazis running Buchenwald knew that Dr. Katzen-Ellenbogen had already collaborated with the Gestapo in France, and he soon was put to work at prisoner intake and also helping with some other medical duties. In return for his collaboration, he got a private room and a real bed, as well as decent food. While most of the inmates of Buchenwald hovered at or near the starvation level, Katzen-Ellenbogen remained not just well-fed, but downright fat during his entire time in the camp. Not surprisingly, all kinds of disease and illness ran rampant through the malnourished prisoners living mostly in cramped, unsanitary conditions. Katzen-Ellenbogen found himself in the very powerful position of controlling access to the supply of medicines for the inmates. He also had added power by being granted the authority to decide whether or not to excuse a particular inmate from their brutal physical labor duties for medical reasons, for illness or injury. And by all accounts, he did not grant access to medicine or grant excuses from work based on any honest triaging of the severity of the inmate's sickness or injury, as one would of course expect a morally decent doctor to do. Instead, it was all about whether he liked you or not, which very often came down to your racial and ethnic characteristics. And it also came down to whether you had something that you were willing to bribe him with. With the help of complicit SS guards, Katzen-Ellenbogen was able to smuggle in some extra medicines, not to help those who needed them most, but to sell in return for money and goods. And as a result, Katzen-Ellenbogen was able to deposit money in a bank account while he was in Buchenwald, as well as to squirrel away various goods that came into the camp from the Danish Red Cross that he would accept as bribes from fellow prisoners. According to Edwin Black, Katzen-Ellenbogen seems to have hated French communists in the camp more than any other group of inmates, because he thought that they were the ones that were bringing diphtheria and scarlet fever into the camp. As Edwin Black writes, quote, "Viewing humanity through a eugenic prism, Katzen-Ellenbogen was capable of exhibiting great compassion toward those he saw as superior, and great cruelty toward those he considered genetically unfit. In Buchenwald, the French, with their Mediterranean and African hybridization, were eugenically among the lowest. They were not really worthy of life. At the same time, in Katzen-Ellenbogen's view, those of Nordic or Aryan descent were treasured, to be helped and even saved. It all followed classic eugenic thought. But in Buchenwald, it was the difference between life and death." End quote. Denying medical care to people in need of it, based purely on their status as eugenically quote-unquote defective, was of course common practice at the sorts of medical facilities Katzen-Ellenbogen had worked at in Massachusetts and New Jersey in the early 20th century, and so he was just carrying the practice on in Buchenwald and taking it to its logical conclusion. During his time at Buchenwald, Katzen-Ellenbogen even served as psychiatrist to the camp's head doctor, one Gerard Schiedlowski, as well as to other Nazis who ran the camp, many of whom were suffering from sleep disorders and other psychological difficulties, no doubt due to the horrifying things they were seeing and inflicting on a daily basis. He even helped one guard who had personally beat over 40 men to death to deal with his trauma from having personally beat 40 men to death. How compassionate of the good doctor. Judges at the Nuremberg trials would say of conditions at camps like Buchenwald, quote, "All the instincts of human decency, which distinguished men from beasts, were forgotten, and the law of the jungle took command. If there was such a thing as a crime against humanity, here we have it repeated 1,000,000 times over." End quote. Katzen-Ellenbogen would ultimately be accused of killing perhaps as many as 1,000 prisoners with lethal injections, but there simply were not enough eyewitnesses who testified of directly seeing him doing it for the charges of murder to stick at his trial after the end of the war. If there had been, he probably would have gotten the death penalty. He was also accused of participating in some of the horrific human experiments at Buchenwald, but Katzen-Ellenbogen's defense was that he had only assisted with quote-unquote pure research, and not with anything that involved experimenting on actual humans. He was also accused of using his skills as a hypnotist in order to get information and confessions out of prisoners on behalf of the SS, but at his trial, Katzen-Ellenbogen denied this as well. One thing that was eugenic in nature that Katzen-Ellenbogen definitely did participate in was assisting the so-called Ancestral Research Barrack at Buchenwald. And this barrack housed a group of prisoners, mostly Czech, who were known as Commando 22A. Now, Commando, and of course the Germans spelled it with a K, didn't mean these were like special forces soldiers, it simply meant a work detail. And Commando 22A was involved with eugenics genealogy research. Among other things, they were tracing the genealogies of SS officers in order to verify their pure Aryan ancestry. And along these lines, Katzen-Ellenbogen was tasked with examining Polish prisoners at Buchenwald, not just physically, but psychologically, in order to identify Poles who had a significant amount of German ancestry, so that these individuals could be exempted from extermination and could be quote-unquote Germanized, basically meaning to be culturally imperialized, to have their Polish culture purged and replaced with German culture. Another doctor at Buchenwald later testified of Katzen-Ellenbogen's work on this, quote, "He was consulting psychiatrists. That is, later on they were Germanizing Poles. For that reason, you had to examine the Poles somatically and psychically, and since later on the SS used us for this delicate mission, I used Katzen-Ellenbogen to write the psychiatric reports." It was a pretty difficult job to talk about the intelligence of a Polish farm worker who didn't even speak German, and Katzen-Ellenbogen speaks some sort of Slavic Esperanto very well. And in all the cases that he wrote for me, and there were at least 60 cases for which he did, he recommended that every one of them should be Germanized, so none of them were hanged. End quote. So Katzen-Ellenbogen would work quite hard to have those that he considered eugenically superior spared from being worked to death in the camps, while he notably would not do the same for those that he considered eugenically inferior. Quite the opposite, in fact. Now, one may not have blamed Katzen-Ellenbogen for some degree of collaboration in order to simply save his own skin, but by all accounts he went far above and beyond what may have been necessary simply just to do that, to save his own skin. He seems to have, even while being imprisoned by the Nazis for his own ethnic ancestry, he seems to have still been enough of a true believer in classical eugenics that he willingly pursued eugenicist goals, even when the Nazis weren't forcing him to do so. He doesn't seem to have had any second thoughts at any point about the righteousness of his eugenic ideology. Even though, again, it was the Nazis' own extreme adherence to those ideas that had resulted in Katzen-Ellenbogen being imprisoned by them in the first place. Even if he'd collaborated to some degree, simply to spare himself from the worst sufferings at Buchenwald. Still, Katzen-Ellenbogen could have used his position of influence with the Nazis there in order to try and help out other prisoners when he could. And he still could have tried to be merciful whenever possible. Other people who were in some way collaborators with the Nazis in similar situations in Nazi camps did do so in various ways, but Katzen-Ellenbogen did not. Instead, seemingly driven by a combination of still believing in eugenics as well as a sociopathic selfishness, he did the opposite. And as I've already kind of mentioned, the only time he really showed mercy or a desire to help out prisoners was when they checked off the right boxes on the eugenicist checklist. In the aftermath of the war, Katzen-Ellenbogen was arrested by Allied authorities in September of 1945. At Katzen-Ellenbogen's trial, Buchenwald survivor Eugen testified, quote, Katzen-Ellenbogen's power in Buchenwald was an entirely extraordinary one. An extraordinarily large one, it should be. He was the man who was feared by the prisoners in the little camp as the man in the background. He had under his command the block doctors, and his influence on them was considerable. End quote. However, convicting Katzen-Ellenbogen of his crimes at Buchenwald proved surprisingly difficult. Partly, it was due to the fact that he was a former Harvard professor, fluent in both the English language as well as American-style jurisprudence, so he was very crafty at defending himself, seizing on all kinds of technicalities and minor discrepancies in order to try to sow reasonable doubt about the worst of the accusations that were made against him. At times, looking at some of the testimony, he almost reminds one of Bill Clinton obfuscating on the question of his relationship with Monica Lewinsky by saying that the answer would depend on what the meaning of the word is. For example, when a prosecutor asked him if his testimonies had been based on his own personal knowledge, Katzen-Ellenbogen responded, quote, most of the things I testified to was of my own personal knowledge. Still, I did not say that everything I said is correct, because I know too well the psychology of testimony. And I think you know it too, from your point of view, that every witness tells objectively the spoken truth. End quote. Whatever that means. Toward the end of his trial, Katzen-Ellenbogen, having done as much to muddy the waters with procedural arguments as well as with statements like what I just quoted from, as well as other seeming contradictions of testimony, said, quote, it is a legal principle of all courts of all nations, the Romans as well in that time, in dubio pro vero, which in English says, give them the benefit of the doubt. That means if you are in doubt about my guilt, you have to acquit me. But if you are in any doubt that I am not guilty, convict me, because I would have a chance then in higher court or any other place to defend myself in a way that perhaps I didn't do here. End quote. On August 14th, 1947, Katzen-Ellenbogen was convicted and sentenced. As Edwin Black writes, quote, without evidence of specific murders, he could not be hanged, as were other medical war criminals at Buchenwald. Instead, the tribunal used the legal theory that applied to so many Nazi conspirators. This theory was called common design, meaning that Katzen-Ellenbogen joined a common design to perpetrate the horrors of Buchenwald on the inmates. It is clear, concluded the tribunal, that the accused, although an inmate, cooperated with the SS personnel managing the camp and participated in the common design. End quote. So, Woodrow Wilson's chief eugenicist, Dr. Edwin Katzen-Ellenbogen, was convicted of participating in the horrifying common design that was Buchenwald. Upon his conviction, Katzen-Ellenbogen seemed to request capital punishment for himself, saying, quote, you have placed the mark of Cain on my forehead. Any physician who committed the crimes I am charged with deserves to be killed. Therefore, I ask only one grace. Apply to me the highest therapy that is in your hands." End quote. But the Allied tribunal did not grant his wish. Instead, he was sentenced to life in prison. This was later commuted to 12 years, but he ended up getting released earlier than that. On September 26, 1953, he was released, ostensibly due to health problems. Information on the rest of his life after being released is extremely scant, but according to at least one source, upon his release, he returned to the U.S., he was after all a U.S. citizen, and even resumed practicing psychiatry until 1955, and he died sometime soon after that. So, thank you for listening to this episode, and I hope that you found the curious case of Dr. Katzen-Ellenbogen to be interesting and informative. Just a few things that I'll mention by way of conclusion, though, of course, feel free to draw your own conclusions from anything I covered here. But some things that struck me as I was working on this episode. One of them is that 100 years ago, American academia, particularly at the most elite levels, was just as ideologically monolithic as it is today, and that the academics of 100 years ago were just as dogmatically all in on the ideology of eugenics as they are today, just as dogmatically in lockstep all in on the ideology that we might call wokeism. And surely today's academics, though they are also self-avowed progressives, would claim that they are totally against the eugenic racist ideologies of the progressives of 100 years ago. But they might not be as different as they might at first appear. Because while some of their hierarchy is different, and in some cases you could argue is an inversion of the hierarchy of 100 years ago, it is still a hierarchy of desirability and undesirability. And it is still based on lumping people into groups based on, in most cases, their immutable inherited characteristics, the things about themselves that nobody chooses, like your race and your ancestry and your ethnicity. And then assigning people various levels of goodness or badness based on those characteristics. Now, 100 years ago, progressive academics would generally place white Northern Europeans at the top and all other ethnic groups in varying degrees of inferiority to that. In other words, the Nordics were the best. The Anglo-Saxons, the Teutons, the Scandinavians, and so forth. And below them were the Central Europeans, then the Southern and Eastern Europeans, and then, the various non-white races of the world arranged in a hierarchy below that. And it was all based on a Darwinian schema of evolutionary fitness. Today, it's the other way around. White people, especially Northern European types, are generally regarded as the worst. And then non-white races are regarded in varying degrees as superior. Now, they would never say this explicitly, but it's pretty obvious that that's what they think. And they do this today based on an ideology that prizes, above all else, supposed victimhood. And so, the more victimized a particular racial or ethnic group is historically, whether it's true or not true, or, partially true and partially not, the more that group is placed on a pedestal as being somehow morally and in other ways superior to the groups that have done the victimizing, the worst, of course, in this ideology being the Northern Europeans. Although it is interesting how many of the academics and how many of the corporate funders of these academics actually are themselves of Northern European ancestry. So it's possible they are self-hating Northern Europeans. It's also possible that they don't truly believe all of this ideology and that they're using it for their own ulterior purposes. And it's also possible, and perhaps most likely, that each individual academic or corporate funder of such academics is one or the other. Is either a true believer in this stuff who, if they are of Nordic ancestry, is simply self-loathing, or they're not self-loathing at all, but they find this ideology for whatever reason useful for the time being. But in either case, those who think that academia being taken over by progressives and academia being ideologically monolithic is something that happened relatively recently, like maybe in the 60s, or maybe even more recently than that, you're completely wrong. American academia was largely turned into an ideological progressive monolith in the last couple decades of the 19th century. Another thing that struck me as I was working on this episode is the irony that American progressivism was, as I've covered in previous episodes of the DHP, largely derived from German historicism, a particular school of thought in terms of looking at history and the so-called social sciences. That alone is kind of ironic considering how American progressives were so staunch in their desire to go to war against Germany in both world wars, including a high degree of racist Teutonophobia in terms of their narrative about the inherently barbaric nature of Germans and so forth. So American progressivism largely came initially from German historicism. And then American progressivism largely in turn created and supported and sustained eugenics as a movement in the early 20th century. And it was American eugenics that then was translated over to Germany in the early 20th century, and that the Nazis picked up and ran with and carried to its logical conclusions. It sort of reminds me of the story of horses, going back into ancient prehistory, where horses, if you don't know, they first evolved in North America. And then from North America, spread over to Eurasia, during the Ice Age when there was a land bridge to Siberia. Eventually that land bridge was resubmerged, and so horses in North America and horses in Eurasia were separated, and over thousands of years, the horses in North America died off. Horses in Eurasia spread all the way across the continent over the millennia and eventually reached Western Europe. And so when the Spanish crossed the Atlantic Ocean and conquered the New World, they brought with them horses. The native peoples they encountered had never seen horses because horses had gone extinct long before any of their living memory. But in reality, what the Spaniards were doing was simply, unknowingly of course, retransplanting these animals that had originated in North America back to where they had originally come from, but had gone, extinct in, if you follow. And in a way, that's kind of like what happened with the ideology of German historicism ultimately turning into Nazism. German historicism spread to the United States, evolved with a few tweaks into American progressivism, which in turn begat eugenics, which in turn was transplanted back over into early 20th century Germany, and which in turn the Nazis then picked up and carried to its logical conclusions. Now, I'm sure if you were to confront Woodrow Wilson with the crimes of the Nazis, which, he never had a chance to know about because he died well before the Nazis took over and did all the things they did. But I'm sure if you were to confront Woodrow Wilson with this, that he would bend over backwards saying how horrible it was and how he would not at all endorse any of it, and it should not be at all seen as deriving from his ideology of American progressivism, but the facts are the facts. And a lot of times, people create and propagate ideologies whose logical conclusions, if taken to their extremes, they themselves don't fully comprehend, and that they themselves would be horrified by and would bend over backwards to distance themselves from if they were confronted with the consequences of their ideas. But such is the human relationship to ideology, philosophy, and history. American progressives would for quite a while back away from eugenics in the aftermath of World War II. It sort of reminds me of the story of the Pledge of Allegiance and the so-called Bellamy Salute, which the short version of this, if you don't know, is that the Pledge of Allegiance was written in the late 19th century by an American sort of progressive socialist type His name was Francis Bellamy. Now, one irony of the fact that this is the guy who wrote the Pledge of Allegiance is that in more modern times, American right-wing conservatives, guys who would be the first to say, oh, no, I want nothing to do with progressive socialism, are the biggest, loudest defenders of forcing everybody, including children, to repeat the Pledge of Allegiance at every opportunity. They are totally ignorant, or don't care, that this pledge was written by an avowed left-wing socialist. But another irony of that is that the original thing that people were supposed to do when reciting the sacred mantra known as the pledge was they were not going to put their hand over their heart. The original gesture was to extend your right hand up and forward. And so for decades, school children, and there are famous photos of this, school children would be doing what essentially is a Sig Heil, before it was called that, as they recited the pledge. Now, the fact that the Nazis picked up the same move and made it their little signature gesture eventually embarrassed Americans into coming up with the hand on heart as a less Nazi-looking substitute gesture while saying the magic words. And I don't think many of them, if any, realized that changing the gesture doesn't change the birds of a feather relationship. That what Americans like Francis Bellamy or Woodrow Wilson have most strongly in common with people like the Nazis is a desire to make the citizens of their state mindlessly obedient and conformist as much as possible in order to make it that much easier for the men running the state apparatus to efficiently do with their human resources what they think is best. And one more thing I'll just say is that, for sure, progressives of today want to distance themselves as far as possible from some of the uglier and especially more racist elements of their ideological ancestors. And as evidence of this, I'll mention that I did not find mention of Edward Katzen-Ellenbogen and his relationship to both Woodrow Wilson and the Nazis in any of the many Woodrow Wilson biographies that I've read. And in the process of researching for the Woodrow Wilson miniseries, which, if you don't know, is still ongoing, I still have multiple episodes to do in the series. It's an even bigger white whale than the Nazi-Civil War was for me. But in all of the many biographies of Wilson that I've read in doing research for this, and these are generally written by people who, like just academics and historians in general, are progressive and so are sympathetic to Woodrow Wilson on pretty much everything other than race. And as such, they often want to try to minimize the uglier aspects of him and his ideology, and one of the most effective ways to do this is simply to lie by omission and leave important things out. So there's things they can't leave out, like, some of the things Wilson did against black people, segregating the civil service and the military and all that sort of stuff. Those things are too big to memory hold. But I can't recall ever seeing Katzen-Ellenbogen mentioned even as a footnote in any Woodrow Wilson biography that I've read. And I believe it was only in one of the many Wilson biographies that I've read where it mentioned the fact that as governor of New Jersey, he passed a eugenics sterilization bill. And that was only very briefly mentioned. And I did not come across any more detail on that or any mention of Edwin Katzen-Ellenbogen and his story until I started reading literature not about Woodrow Wilson or about American progressivism as such, but about eugenics specifically. So Edwin Katzen-Ellenbogen, this bizarre individual who provides a 1 degree of separation link between Woodrow Wilson and American progressivism and the Nazis, has largely been memory holed by modern-day progressives. What a shocker.